But right now, I'm going to turn this over to Jen Miller from League of Women Voters, and she is going to introduce our panel of folks who will be updating us and discussing all the latest things that have been going on in the past week in our continuing Ohio redistricting saga. So Jen.
Hello, Fair Districts Ohio family. You are definitely my high point and always will be. It's my honor to introduce our three speakers. And I think you should know all three. A lot of you will know all three of these. David Daley was with us in when we actually on election night in 2018 and has been with us off and on. He's a famous guy who's helped spark the recent drive for gerrymandering reform. So he does have the Rat Effed book as well as Unrigged, which I'm just going to note the colors of that seem very similar to the Fair District's colors. So I'm going to think that maybe that we inspire you. Kidding. But he's a former editor-in-chief for Salon. He has pieces in the New Yorker, Washington Post, The Guardian, New York Magazine, Atlantic, Rolling Stone, so many. A graduate of Quinnipiac University School of Law, Rory Riley Tapping is a legal analyst for Spectrum One. She is an opinion contributor on Veterans Affairs for The Hill, and many of you have probably seen her on with our buddy Josh with Spectrum. She's been following the redistricting process closely. And then last but certainly not least, our dear friend Kathay Feng, who has led the Common Cause's work nationally to challenge gerrymandering through litigation and ballot initiatives and legislation. She was previously the executive director of the California Common Cause, where she championed a whole bunch of different good governance reforms, and it was the architect for the California Citizens Redistricting Commission. She's a graduate of Cornell, and she has a law degree from UCLA. Welcome, you three. We're so glad to have you.
Just going to make sure that Kathy's unmuted. Give me 1 second.
Thank you.
There we go.
Hi, everybody. Great. And I guess we want to make sure that our two speakers are unmuted. Let's get straight to it. Rory and Dave, I am so excited to have you here tonight, joining us as legal and investigative journalists, but really because you are, like me, redistricting nerds. And you just can't get enough. And frankly, Ohio gives and keeps on giving. I'm going to give you all a couple of rapid fire questions, hoping that you can kind of respond in short, 3-minute segments, and then we'll open it up to our activists to ask questions. So I'm just going to let people know, listen along, and then at some point I'll prompt you to put any questions that you might have in the chat box. And I just want to be sure that Rory has joined us.
Yeah, I'm here.
Us?
Yep, I'm here.
Oh, great. Okay, sorry, I'm not seeing you on the screen, but fantastic. Okay, Rory, so catch us up on the latest episode of Survivor Ohio, Heroes versus Politicians. What are the details of what the court has asked for and what the Politician Commission presented last week?
Sure. So obviously a lot of people here were part of those procedures last week, so they know that there were meetings that took place with the two independent map makers, and the reason that we had those meetings is because of what the court asked for in its most recent decision that had rejected the commission's third set of maps. So specifically, what the court had asked for was that they wanted the commission to pass an entirely new map by March 28th and file it with the court the next day. And what the court did in this decision, which was different from its prior decisions, was it clarified its requirements, saying that the commission should work with an independent map maker. They hadn't made reference to independent map makers before, and they emphasized that the drafting should occur in public and that the commissioners should be convening frequent meetings to demonstrate their bipartisan efforts to reach a constitutional plan with the time that was set by the court. So, of course, the court also reiterated the constitutional requirements that have been at issue the entire time in this back and forth litigation that needs to be complied with. And again, they spent a lot of time emphasizing that one of those requirements is not favoring one political party. We've obviously seen that over and over again. So initially what we saw obviously was what looked like some positive progress towards constitutional maps. The meetings were taking place, they were televised, the independent map makers were working on it. But then what we saw is really what I have referred to as a bait and switch, because the maps that were ultimately passed were not the ones that were part of that process that the court outlined. They weren't the ones that the independent map makers had worked on. They weren't the ones that were being discussed in these open and televised meetings. And they were once again unilaterally worked on by partisan staff. So it wasn't a bipartisan process. So I think it's a bit ironic to hear when the Republican commission members said that they did this because they were so concerned with the court's deadline, because obviously they'd missed the court's deadlines in the past and said that the court's deadlines were simply impossible to comply with. So they're really trying to blame the court here, which I think is an interesting tactic, since this is going back before the court. And I know we'll get into some of the subsequent issues pertaining to contempt a little bit later. So I just think that even though the court asked for transparency, bipartisanship, and independent map makers, even though we saw the beginnings of what that should look like, the end result that we got wasn't in effect what the court asked for.
Right. I know that, Dave, you've been watching this process in Ohio, as you have been around the country, you know, compared to many other states. I'm curious if you had 3 adjectives that you could describe what's been going on in Ohio. What are those 3 adjectives that you would use to describe Ohio compared to what's happening in other states?
That's a great question. And first, thank you. Thank you to Common Cause, to the League, to Fair Districts Ohio, to Kathy, and to Jen, and to Catherine, to all of you who have been so inspiring and inspired me watching you all. I would start with the word of the day in Ohio politics. I would start with contempt. I would say that this has been a contemptuous process, and that it's the lawmakers, the Republican lawmakers on this commission, that have held the voters and the people of Ohio in contempt throughout this process. And it is all the more infuriating to me after watching the introduction here tonight and seeing what they're holding in contempt. What they're holding in contempt is the work of the people coming together across party lines to engage in the process of democracy and ensure representative elections for the next decade. And this is the process of getting petitions signed and pressing buttons and attending watch parties and going to hearings and writing letters to the editor. This is the stuff of democracy. And I would say that the lawmakers in Ohio have showed contempt for that. I would say that the process has been lawless. I would say that this has been a willful disregard of the Ohio Constitution. I would go as far as to say it could be willful disregard of the Voting Rights Act of Section 2, when you look at what was done in Hamilton County and the way that minority voters there were cracked and packed in those districts. There's a very clear and clean process that is described in this amendment, and the lawmakers again and again have simply refused to do it. They've refused to do it once, twice, 3 times under court order, with bait and switches, time and again. But finally, I would say that there's been a ferocity on the other side as well. And this is what I think is perhaps so important. And this is why this is not going to stand. Because you all didn't stop on that night in May of 2018. You kept going because you knew you had to defend what you had won, that it wasn't going to be enough to pass this law and change this law. You were going to have to be there every step of the way to see it through, to do the work of democracy, that the tending, that democracy is a verb, right? It's something we have to do and hold and work at if we want to keep And I don't think that the politicians in this state expected you to keep paying attention, to keep showing up, to keep demanding fairness. You've got a courageous Chief Justice that has stood up again and again and protected this process. And the fact that you're going to have fair maps is not only due to what you all did in 2018, but it's testimony to what you have done in the previous 4 years.
Very good. Contemptuous, lawless, and I think you said ferocity.
I'm not sure they're all adjectives.
Ferocity of the volunteers who really have stuck to it. I think that that's a really good note to end on. Rory, Dave brought up the contempt issue. Tell us why the court is now considering holding the political commission in contempt. What happens if a contempt is found? What kind of punishment could possibly happen?
Sure. So the main reason that the court is considering contempt is obviously because the commission hasn't been following the court's orders. In fact, they've flagrantly violated them. And that's in part why we're having this conversation today. So the court initially raised a contempt motion sua sponte, meaning it did it on its own. So the court was aggravated enough that they raised this issue about contempt. They did that back in the middle of February and had ordered the commissioners to explain why they shouldn't be held in contempt. And at that time, they had said, well, you know, even though we missed this past deadline, oh, we're working so hard and we're working in good faith. So we're really close to getting this next set of maps. And this time we're going to get it right. So the court gave them the benefit of the doubt. And I think that's important to note. As frustrating it is for everybody else who's watching this process, contempt is really supposed to be seen as a last resort in the legal realm. So the court did continue the hearing, and I think that that's important to note. They didn't call it off; they just continued it and said, "Well, we'll see, and we'll bring it back to a later date." So obviously, we've seen since that time that the third set of maps have likewise been held to be non-constitutionally compliant. So we went through what we just talked about with this process with the independent map makers, and then this fourth set of maps that kind of came out of nowhere and that are very likely not constitutionally compliant either. So the petitioners then filed a motion for contempt, and that's the other way. There's two ways contempt can be brought up. The court can do it on its own, or an opposing party can file it. So now we've got both of those types of contempt motions on the table. There's the one that the court raised on its own that's still pending, and now there's this new one that was filed as a result of this fourth set of maps. So if they hold the commission in contempt, there's really two types of penalties, and there's supposed to be this punitive effect that comes with contempt. And one of the other aspects of contempt is really supposed to be some kind of public embarrassment. But I feel like given the personalities that we're dealing with here, they almost wear that like a badge of honor. And so what we would traditionally see in a the decorum of a legal setting is almost non-applicable here. But with that being said, the court does have the ability by both statute and case law to impose fines or jail time. We saw yesterday the responses to the most recent contempt motion were due. And we saw a lot of arguments about the separation of powers and legislative immunity, since the commission is comprised of elected officials. I think it's important to note that even though legislative immunity is a thing, it's not absolute. So, for example, we saw a case out of Wisconsin last week where a judge held an elected official in contempt and gave them 2 weeks to comply. That person was concealing records pertaining to the 2020 election. And they said that they were imposing a fine of $1,000 a day for every day past that 14 days that they were not in compliance. So even though the commissioners directly have tried to say that there's nothing they can be held in contempt for, this is kind of the quintessential case of why contempt exists. So I think absolutely, if they're going to go forward with this hearing, I think at this point, the court has tried to be very conservative in its response. And again, given the commissioners the benefit of the doubt, probably more than I think many people would have liked them to. So I think that we will see, hopefully, at a minimum, I think we'll see that hearing, and hopefully we'll see some sort of punitive actions attached to that, probably in the form of, similar to what we just talked about, the case we saw in Wisconsin. It would probably be some sort of fine.
Right. Dave, you have looked at many other states, seen a lot of contemptuous behavior by legislative leaders as they gerrymander their states. How bad are Ohio's political commission actions compared to the bad acts that you see in other states?
There we go. Great.
On.
I'm sorry. I muted myself because that was my dog, my barking dog. Yes. Contemptuous behavior has been on the rise across the nation throughout this entire process. I think what we've really seen has been a partisan bloodbath across the country during this entire redistricting cycle. There's a lot of stories being written right now that I think are really wrong-headed, that talk about how this has been a fair process, and Democrats and Republicans have evened out the map and undone some of the gerrymanders of the last decade. And I think that actually what you've seen is a maximally gerrymandered map in just about every state that it's possible to do that, and a dramatic reduction in the number of competitive seats. And that much of this has come at the cost of communities of color that have actually been driving the population growth in so many of these states that have been gaining congressional seats, but they have seen their political power actually decrease under these maps. It's both parties. What Democrats have done in New York with a 24-3 map, I believe, that a judge there correctly threw out, I believe, last week for being a violation of the 2014 state constitutional amendment that put an end to partisan gerrymandering, was, an absolutely brutal partisan gerrymander. What Democrats did in Illinois, what a judge has put a stop to in Maryland, what we have seen from Republicans in North Carolina that the state Supreme Court undid, what we have seen in Texas and Georgia, what we're watching unfold right now in Florida. This continues to be an absolute partisan bloodbath. So much of the responsibility for that, I think, sits at the hands of the US Supreme Court and the just disastrous decision in 2019 in a case that Common Cause brought all the way to the US Supreme Court heroically, and only to see the court effectively close the doors to these claims in federal courts. And so what we have seen is just the runaway festival of partisan gerrymandering that Paul Smith warned would happen during that case.
Yeah. Rory, I'm going to combine a couple of questions that are coming in from our volunteers and activists. One is from Mary who's asking, is there any hope for the maps that were drawn by the independent map makers to be considered at some point by the court or be presented to the court? And I guess a somewhat related question is, if we look at the transparent mapping process that took place between March 23rd and 28th, what can we learn from it? Are there some takeaways that we might be able to either present to the court or frankly present to the public, about how that process works? And I guess I'll present the first part to Rory and the second part to Dave.
Sure. So with regard to whether the independent map makers maps, if there's any hope for them, part of where this gets tricky is because obviously when the constitutional amendment was passed, they included specific language that said that the court can't draw the maps or direct that certain maps be adopted. So the court probably isn't going to say explicitly that those maps have to be adopted, but I think that we've seen the court isn't going to just back down. We've seen that they've stayed in this and they've still continued to call out unconstitutional behavior, even though, again, it's taken multiple iterations of this process, which has certainly been very frustrating to everybody involved. So I think the court in its decisions, and I think a lot of these decisions, even though they're quite lengthy, they contain a lot of good dicta explaining why they've done things the way that they have. And I think that that's kind of the takeaway, is that there will most likely be some discussion about those maps and about the process that led to the creation of those maps in a subsequent decision from the court. And even though they can't directly say, they can certainly point to the fact explicitly that when the commission has been left to its own devices, they have violated the Constitution 3, probably soon to be 4 times, and that they've made it very clear that they are not able to put their partisan concerns aside. I think that with each decision, even though the court is repeating itself, they do get a little bit pointier with their language. And I envision that they'll be doing the same thing here, that they can talk about the fact that once again, I think they'll say a little bit more explicitly, the commission hasn't been able to put partisanship aside. The independent map makers did. That's why we directed to work with them. And even if there are constraints about time, certainly those are things that could have been avoided. And I think that kind of transitions into the questions that you wanted to ask Dave for what we saw with that process. I think that's another important thing to note, is that they framed their argument about why they couldn't use these independent map makers maps around the fact that just wasn't enough time. But obviously we saw some filibuster tactics at work there. And, again, I'll let him pick it up from there.
You wanted me to weigh in on?
Yes. What did we learn? What did we learn from the transparent mapping process that just took place? Both, that as a story that we can present to the court, but also for the public to understand.
We learned that it's possible to draw a 54-46 map. We learned that it's possible to draw that map quickly in the span of a few days. We learned that the natural political geography of Ohio is not a supermajority for one side or a 75-25 congressional delegation. I think that there's an awful lot that's been learned here. And what we've seen throughout this process has been that state courts have stepped up. They've done the work that the US Supreme Court abdicated. And justices in Ohio, justices in Wisconsin, in North Carolina, in Maryland, in New York, have really defended the work that citizen reformers won and have really held lawmakers to account. Now, because I think there always has to be a dark lining, you're seeing impeachment being threatened of these justices for standing up for democracy and doing their job. This is not a new thing. This is the same thing that happened in North Carolina. It's the same thing that happened in Pennsylvania. I imagine we could be looking at it in Wisconsin. These are elected positions, so I think it's extraordinarily dangerous to have 10 years of maps depend on what are oftentimes down ballot off-season elections that all of a sudden are going to have a lot of money thrown at them. But for right now, what we're seeing is that judges can do this. Judges understand these rules. Judges can enforce these rules, and they're doing so.
I think that that's a really good point. Can we come back to the impeachment question? Rory, what would justify the impeachment of a sitting judge?
So it's important to note, I think, that impeachment obviously is an inherently political process, but in order to technically justify it, it's supposed to be used for grave ethical or criminal violations. I mean, we're talking about things like perjury, fraud, conflicts of interest, that sort of thing. And I think that, a little bit of history is really insightful on this topic. So people who remember shouldn't say remember, but remember reading about back in 1804, President Thomas Jefferson tried to have a Supreme Court Justice, Samuel Chase, impeached because he openly criticized Jefferson in some of his arguments. And he ultimately was impeached. He wasn't convicted, but this really set the parameters for how we view judicial impeachment up and through today. And at that point in time, there's a lot of dialogue and discourse about the fact that we shouldn't be impeaching judges for their judicial acts. Judges are supposed to be immune from political pressure and when they're making rulings from the bench. So impeaching justices for partisan disagreements really flies in the face of that. And I know former Chief Justice William Rehnquist wrote a book about the history of judicial impeachment, and I wrote down, there was a quote from it that I wanted to bring up, where he said, let me give it 1 second. Judicial acts, their rulings from the bench, should not be a basis for removal of office by impeachment and conviction. And so, this is a former Supreme Court justice that's saying this. And I think if you look at that quotation, that is exactly what we're seeing here, is somebody who they're talking about impeaching from their judicial acts, their rulings from the bench because of a partisan disagreement. That's completely the opposite of the way this process is supposed to work.
Right. Dave, talk to us about what you see as, what is possible from here on out, based on kind of your observation. Where do you think the parties will take it? Where will the court kind of go with this? They've got the fourth version of a set of maps that, I think the court is going to find to be unconstitutional again. And what do you prognosticate about next steps, and how do we bring this all to an end?
It's a great question, and Rory and Jen and everybody there probably has a better understanding than me of the ins and outs of where this is going to go. What it looks like, I think you're right. I think that this court is going to find that this map is unconstitutional and that it repeats all of the same over partisan nature that the previous maps have engaged in. And from there, I think things get tricky. I think you're looking at the possibility, right, of congressional elections on the 2022 gerrymandered maps that would extend that gerrymander for another couple of years. I don't know how that works exactly, losing one congressional seat, but I think that's dangerous. And I think there's parallel action underway, I believe, in federal court as well, which I think brings to mind the specter of what the US Supreme Court has done when these cases have reached their doorstep in the last few weeks from Wisconsin and from Georgia and Alabama. And they've really, stepped in and said, well, you can't be changing maps this close to election day. And they tend to do that, especially when the map that is already existing favors the Republican Party. That has been, they had no problem doing that. They said that the Alabama map had to go back to the previous one because it was too late, too close to another election to add another majority Black district. But when the Wisconsin map added another majority Black state legislative district, the Supreme Court did not have the same problem. They ordered a new map drawn there, even though it was 6 weeks closer to the election.
Right.
So if this ends up at the U.S. Supreme Court, which it could, through the shadow docket, I think this could end up in a frustrating place. And then you've got another Chief Justice coming into office, perhaps as early as next year. Am I right about? So you all have got a lot of work to do. This fight is not going to be over. You're going to have to stay involved and engaged a whole lot longer.
So Rory, maybe you can unpack this a little bit, because I think we've got a couple of questions, one from Mosey, one from Robert, who are kind of asking, help us understand where the 3-judge federal panel comes in, because so far up until now, what we've been talking about is the state maps and how they're challenged, and the discussion that we've had about Maureen O'Connor has been about state court review, right? But there is also a 3-judge federal panel, and can you tell us like how those two cases relate, or maybe untangle that a little bit for the folks who are on this webinar?
Sure. So there is, like you noted, a parallel federal case, and that was filed by Republican activists who basically argued that by not having legislative maps in place, their constitutional right to vote was violated. So that's the basis of that lawsuit. And obviously, they are in, I think, cahoots with some of the Republicans on the Redistricting Commission, because if you look at the overall strategy of this, one of the specific requests for relief in that federal case was for the second legislative map to be enacted, because they said they found it to be constitutional enough, that it could be used, and that they were asked for the enforcement of the May 3rd primary. So there was an argument on this case that took place last week as well. Initially, when the federal court looked at this, they basically said, well, the Ohio Supreme Court has jurisdiction, we're going to take a step back and we're going to see what they do. And I think that what we saw with the bait and switch maps is part of this overall strategy that incorporates the federal lawsuit, because what that 3-judge panel had previously said was the Ohio Supreme Court has rejected this map, and so we're not going to get involved with that. By passing this 4th set of maps after the fact, the Ohio Supreme Court hasn't rejected those maps yet. So they think we're really hoping that the panel would rule and accept that map on the grounds that they had previously said, well, we're not going to accept one that the Ohio Supreme Court has rejected. They thought by doing this, we're going to insert a map that hasn't been rejected and, basically does the same thing and see if we can get away with it. I think it's also interesting, the makeup of that panel. You've got 2 Trump-appointed judges that are on the panel. And this is something that we see a lot in terms of legal strategy. They call it forum shopping, where you try to file a case in a court that you think is going to be most receptive to your arguments. And I think that the Republican activists that are pushing for these prior versions of the maps that the Ohio Supreme Court has found unconstitutional, they thought that that might be their best bet to get a sympathetic audience, because they're obviously not getting it in state court. Now, they've said that they've extended the deadline until April 20th. And so we have a few more weeks to see what the Ohio Supreme Court is going to do on these maps. Again, as we've talked about, I think it's likely that they reject the 4th set of maps too. But based on that Supreme Court precedent that we talked about earlier, I think that if you listened to the argument in that federal case, they were a little reluctant to get involved. And I actually think that that is probably the right approach at this point. Obviously, partisan gerrymandering, the proper forum for that is state court. And while the process in our state court has really been convoluted and I think more drawn out than most people would like to see, they are addressing it. As Dave alluded earlier, state courts have really stepped up to the plate. And so I think that even though this federal lawsuit is ongoing, they have, thus far at least, been willing to defer to the state court, which is the right thing to do.
Right. Okay. So, Dave, notwithstanding the cherry picking that the U.S. Supreme Court may be doing in terms of taking or not taking cases and letting some things be stayed that are good maps and other things go forward that are bad maps, do you think that the federal courts will stay out of Ohio for the moment, based on what Rory's saying?
I don't know. I mean, I think what we've seen the court do from the shadow docket in some of these redistricting cases, especially on the racial gerrymandering cases, has been egregious and anti-democratic and shocking, and speaks to a real desire on behalf of the majority on this court to really go after what they've allowed to remain of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And I think that that's what we're going to see coming up. There is this notion of the independent state legislature doctrine that when the court decided not to get involved in the North Carolina and Pennsylvania cases earlier this year, they let those go. There were there were 3 justices who were ready to effectively say that the elections clause in the Constitution means that the legislature has effectively unfettered control over election matters and redistricting without fear of veto by a governor or statutory review by a Supreme Court. And, that to me would not only be anti-democratic, it would undo, decades of precedent and really create, shocking power in the hands of already gerrymandered bodies. So I don't know what this court is going to do. I hope that it can get settled in Ohio first and quickly.
Okay, let's see if we can get 1 or 2 more questions. We've got a question from Glenn Campbell asking, Rory, can you please explain what's going on with the congressional maps? There's a lot of people who just don't understand kind of what is still possible with the congressional maps at this point. Now that early voting has started, can anything change, or are we essentially stuck with it until 2024?
So I think that the answer to your question is we could see something, but I think it's unlikely. I mean, because we have early voting starting. And again, this goes back to so much of this has been strategy, and we've seen that strategy has been delay. And this is exactly playing into what the Republicans wanted. They wanted to delay, and there is Supreme Court precedent and doctrine that says when you get too close to an election, you don't interfere, as we talked about that. And I think that that's really unfortunate. Part of what's going on with the congressional maps, as we saw, was that the last round of challenges were rejected on jurisdictional grounds. And, this is where the law gets technical and boring and messy. And, it's not all these sexy substantive arguments where, somebody declares something unconstitutional. There's a jurisdictional issue where they said, you don't have jurisdiction over this, so you have to file a new lawsuit. And that really brought the clock back. And I think that was really frustrating to a lot of people, because from a technical standpoint, you would have hoped that would have been caught earlier in the process. And if that was the case, that a new lawsuit would have been ready to be filed earlier on. But obviously, as we know, many people in this space are volunteers. People are constrained by resources. What happens in an ideal world isn't always what happens in reality. So again, as far as the congressional maps, I think with early voting starting, again, there's a chance that we see something, because there is other litigation on this that is still pending. But based on the briefing timeline that the court has set, I don't think we're going to see anything substantive in time to interfere with this election. And I think that that's really unfortunate, because it's essentially rewarding bad behavior. It's saying, if you drag your feet and you delay, you're going to get your way. And I think that, unfortunately, even if we go through this again in 2024, they're going to say, well, this was successful when we did it last time, so we're just going to do the same thing again. And how do you break that cycle of rewarding bad behavior?
And it's being copied in many other states.
Is being like North Carolina and being in a lawsuit for the entire decade.
So can I just say, I lived in North Carolina before I moved to Ohio. And, I was in North Carolina for 4 years before this. And after going through things in North Carolina, I thought, oh, God, this has to be the most dysfunctional state. And then I came here and it was like,
welcome to Ohio.
I feel like it's me. I feel like there's like a black cloud following me around.
No,
this is the work of a lifetime, though, people. I see a couple of people in the comments saying, but this is so discouraging. And we thought we had won this and we have to keep going. Yes, you do. Because this is not going to be fixed by any one election, by any one victory. It's going to be fixed only by all of us staying involved, all of us fighting on, all of your ferocity, all of that inspiration and hard work. A democracy has never been easy in this country. the history of democracy in
think
this
that
country is complicated.
I think that sentiment is a perfect one to end on. Let me just ask you each one idea. If you could wave a magic wand, if you could help get that next initiative on the ballot and, voted on by a supermajority of Ohioans, what's the one thing that you would change? And I know that there are many things, but what's the one thing that you would try to tackle? Rory, you go first.
I would probably try to tackle the makeup of the commission. I know in the initial Supreme Court decision that rejected the first set of maps, they talked extensively about the fact that other states use nonpartisan commissions to draw those maps. And I think we've seen our partisan elected officials can't get out of their own way when it comes to the partisanship. So if I could change one thing, I would say it would be to change the makeup of the commission and to put some sort of process in place that used nonpartisan commission makers in the future.
David, what would you do?
I would plus one what Rory just said. Absolutely. I also think that we have to think about the fact that it's not just redistricting that's part of our problem, it's districting itself, and that single member districts have become sort of part of the problem and enforcing these lines and making them so important, and that the time perhaps has come to also be thinking about commissions plus, and to be thinking about how we might use proportional representation that would take the importance of these districts away, and I think also go a long way towards ensuring that every district is a swing district and that minority voters have got the ability to elect every place.
All right, on that hopeful note, I'm going to hand it back to Mia. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions. We did try to answer a lot of them, but I want to thank our two guests, Dave and Rory, for joining us today, giving us so many insights on this process. Giving us a little bit of hope at the end. This energy has really been amazing. And thank you everybody for showing that in the face of contemptuous behavior and lawless behavior, you have countered it with ferocity. Thank you, everybody.